And I think that, from a lot of perspectives, including things like securing data and supply chain, we should be thinking about kind of the whole ecosystem behind the model, not just the model. And then finally, I'd say, I would push back from the outset at the open versus closed kind of positioning, especially for policymakers, because a lot of the considerations you have for regulating AI or accelerating AI are going to be the same kind of across open and closed models. So I wouldn't, I want to kind of keep that commonality in mind. And kind of both kinds of models give more economic opportunity to developers to be able to choose, the right kind of tool for the business application that they're building.
It's a really good response there, Mike. And just sort of building off of that, I'd open it up to other people on the panel here. So what would motivate an organization, whether a startup or a big tech firm, or a research lab, to release their models either open or keep them proprietary? Frank, would you like to jump in on that?
Sure. Just turning my mic on. So I think there's a lot of different reasons that companies will engage with open models, and I think my background is studying open source software, and of course we all live in AI, so everything's about AI now, and the way we think about business models around open source software is a little bit different than how we think about open source AI, but often we think about different reasons why companies would do it, and they've generally boiled down to: one is attracting more customers. So if our models are open and free to use, and then more people can use them and engage with them, then that's going to attract more people, and maybe we have something extra bells and whistles that we can charge them for, and we can make money that way. The more traditional way to think about open source is on the cost side. And so, if you're a company that has developed a model or a software package or something, and you don't want to be responsible for doing 100% of the maintaining of it, but you want it to continue to live, you can make it open source and then hope that the community out there will maintain it and help you keep it running and everything like that. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes people open stuff and nobody shows up, but it is a way to think about keeping, if that's not a super core piece to your business model, but you want the software to continue to grow, you can open it up and potentially have external people contribute to it to lower your own internal costs. So I think usually we think about that. And I think certainly with startups versus larger established firms, there's the reasons that they'll open source things will definitely differ. And I also do think one of the more recent pieces of research that we've been doing is that it turns out that developers like working on open source and contributing to open source. And so many companies will engage with open source as a way to attract better talent and attract better developers as well, because it's kind of like seen as a perk or a way that they can stay involved in the cutting edge, even if they're doing things that don't only benefit the company.
So Jesse, building off on that and based on the research that you've done at RAND, what have you found that says what's the particular motivation for business as to whether or not they focus on an open model or a proprietary one?
Well, I would say that it's a package of strategies that's involved, right? On the one hand, there is the kind of market consideration. What is their market for? What the targeted users would be interested in. I hope it's not my right mic.
Sounds like it. Just keep going. Yeah.
Okay. So then, from that perspective, then a company will think about what their strategy would be to kind of dominate, maybe not the entire market, but a specific segment of the market that they're interested in, based on the type of characteristics that their targeted customers would want on the model that they want to use. And I also want to say that I think it's an interactive environment where developer strategy, user preference, and policy environment will all shape what this market looks like. I do think that when it comes to open and closable model, it's a spectrum, like Michael said, right? It's not just one or the other.
Yeah.
So kind of where you can carefully place yourself that can generate the most value in the policy environment that you work with would probably be what eventually incentivize the organizations to think about where they want to stand.
Excellent. So then building off of that, Carl, I'd like to ask your question. In terms of openness for collaboration and accessibility, it seems like there's very good reasons for that. Are there other strategic reasons behind it as well?
Yes, I think just like Frank said, I think building a developer ecosystem and community is extremely important. So, and also the trust, right? So building the trust, once you get open, people can sort of openly test it. And that's extremely important. I think from the sort of more commercial side of things, I think one of the advantage of going open source is that you really, I mean, if your technical strength is there, you really save a lot of marketing dollars, so to speak. So I think, yeah.
Great. Well, thanks for that. I'm going to go through a various targeted questions to each of our speakers where we try and sort of define the nuances of the open AI landscape. So Frank, let's start with you. In your research, how does the decision between open versus closed technology influence performance? And on top of that, do you think the same can be said about emerging open AI models?
Sure, great question. So I think traditionally open source was thought of as a cost saver, right? So when we think about performance, we think about the inputs versus the outputs, right? And traditionally it was thought about as it's free, it's cheap, it's going to save us costs on the back end, and that's how it's going to enhance performance. But what my research and others have shown is that especially as we move more towards cutting edge technologies like AI and data analytics, where the frontier of the technology is open source, we're seeing bigger impacts on the output side as well, right? And so I think this, yes, there's still some cost savings per traditional open source, but as we move more towards cutting edge, we'll see those companies that are engaging in open benefiting more than some of those that are engaging in closed. Now, I'll caveat that by saying I think it's a lot of the research that myself and my team have done show that not all companies will benefit in the same way. So those that already have some level of technical capability, or depending on exactly what they're building, may benefit more from using open, and others may, that have less technical capability, or the technology is not kind of critical to what they're producing, may benefit more from proprietary, right? So I'm very much in the same vein as Mike, that it's not one or the other, it's more about right tool for the right time. But certainly for those that have the ability to take advantage of the open source and tweak it and customize it in more ways than you can with closed source, then they're going to be able to take advantage of that.
That's really helpful, Frank. And so let's go to Mike then. At GitHub, from your role there, we know that GitHub's played a massive role in making open source available to everyone. But with AI, there's a growing debate about whether these models should be open to the public or whether they should be kept closed. So how do you think we should strike that balance? And how can we keep encouraging innovation without opening the door to misuse and lack of control?
Yeah, well, I think it's somewhat of a false dichotomy. Obviously, open models are out there, and I think a lot of the fear about that, 2 years ago, has kind of passed with experience, both because terrible things haven't happened, but more so, people have experience using those models now, and they're kind of a key part of global learning about how to do AI safely and responsibly. I think we haven't talked about the kind of research motivation for open models yet. I think all of the answers have been kind of couched in what are kind of the commercial incentives. But I think both in corporate labs, which kind of cross over, but also increasingly in academia and even kind of smaller open source communities, there's a big motivation to release open models in part to enable this kind of, let's figure out how as a society we deal with AI. And I think the really, in my initial answer, I kind of said that a lot of the policy considerations are similar for AI, whether the model weights are available or not. And I think the key thing to remember is really marginal risk, and you need to think about that for AI overall. What marginal risk does having AI be available, versus a baseline world with no AI at all? That has to be. That's like the overwhelming question. And then what is the marginal risk for having model weights available or not? And you also have to think about the marginal benefit as well. There's a ton of again, like research into how we can use like uplift our cybersecurity capabilities, and by using AI and having researchers have access to the open model weights can only help with that.
That's great. So then moving on to Carl, and DeepSeek started by providing its model open and letting everyone use it. What drove that decision, and what are the biggest challenges you faced with going open?
I think the main driver will be accelerate the R&D, and so also, like I said, build trust, because again, as a Chinese little known R&D lab, right, by making everything transparent and people can validate it, that builds trust, and also foster a developer community. It's a major incentive. And the challenges will be really like, misuse could be one, and then also, funding the compute costs, although we're pretty smart about doing algorithm innovation, but still need to fund the compute cost. And lastly, is also competing with the closed source system that typically has a more polished, like, user experience, right? And then, so those are the drivers and challenges.
Great, very interesting. Jesse, let's move on to you now, given all the exciting research that you're doing at RAND. So some people say that AI helps society by spreading innovation, while others say it's a dangerous underbelly. From a policy perspective, how should we think about what's at stake in this debate versus open and closed models?
So one of the things that I want to clarify about innovation is one of the things in our work that we really want to highlight is when we say innovation, it's a broad term when it comes to what type of innovation we're referring to. We can still have innovation with closed models, right? That's AI-assisted innovation. That's not necessarily innovation on AI technology itself. So I think both are true when it comes to risk and innovation for a model on the entire spectrum, going from completely closed to many things open. And I think from a policy perspective, I think there's three things that are important. The first one is, regardless of it's open or closed, the speed of reaction, because this is a really fast-moving field. So promptness of addressing challenges associated with AI use, open or closed, is important. And at the same time, right, the openness of the model means once this material is out there, it's really difficult to call back. So it's more important that you really think ahead of time about what should be our responses, which leads to the second part, which is I think policy, we really need to think about guiding principles, right? It's not specific policies that we're going to be in place because it may not be relevant once the technology evolves. It may not be relevant once the market looks different when it comes to what type of models are out there. So guiding principles should be set up early, and then we think as we react to different changes in the market, and we think, well, falling under that overarching principle, what should we do? And the third one, which is, I think, complementary to what Mike is saying. On one hand, they're common, right? AI technology has use and challenges that we should address. But on the other hand, the models are different based on what type of accessibility and what users can change. So there's a lot of advantage in trying to make sure that guidelines and regulations are tailored to these type of model changes in a way that you minimize the risk, but still kind of maximize the flexibility for innovation to give you that really good kind of trade-off so that you can get to a place where you can fully take advantage of the technology and potential benefits for innovation, but minimize the risk associated.
So when you talk about regulating it somewhat differently between those two models, can you give us a little more specific sense about how you would do that between the open versus closed models?
Well, I think this is where a lot of research needs to happen, right? Understanding the ground game of how developers are providing these model-related services to users and how users are engaging with them. So ideally, these would be done through looking at empirical data, really going deep into the industry to hear how they're implementing it. Because then the danger is, once you design tailored policy, you really want to make sure it's effective in the sense that it is targeting what you want to target. You don't want too much unintended consequences where you leave out risk unaddressed, or you overregulate, and that can hinder innovation. So that's where I think there's a huge role for policymakers to make a difference here, to think about how we can foster the environment.
That was really excellent. So now I think I'd like to pivot the conversation slightly to another side where we look at the weighting between the practical benefits and the potential danger. So I'm going to ask another question that I'll open it up to anybody on the panel. So how does open AI always lead to more innovation, or can too much openness slow down innovation? Yeah, Carl.
Do you want me?
Do it, go ahead.
Sure.
Okay, so this is, what we hear all the time, because the speed of innovation in the Gen AI space, I've been in tech for 30 years, right? Shows my age. This is the fastest, right? So one of the challenges for a lot of people tracking it is that like almost a model come every day, if not every hour. So that's really make sort of the people tracking it more difficult. So I think it's key to have certain set of evaluation tools where you can really filter out the goods and bads. So like that's kind of just my 2 cents.
Great. Frankie, do you want to build on that a bit?
Yeah, so I think when we're thinking about open versus closed in general and the role it plays in innovation, right? We live in the US, we have a patent system, and the whole point of that is to allow people to be sort of open, but also have a monopoly on whatever it is that they've invented, right? And certainly in some industries, we'll just point to pharmaceuticals as an example, that's a huge incentive to innovate, because once you develop a new drug, then you have a monopoly over that for however long, 20 years or so. But I think when we think about AI, and to Carl's point, the speed with which it moves and the way that it progresses, like who's going to care about a patent on software that's 20 years old? Nobody, right? Like, so I think that's one of the big differences when we think about different types of industries and different types of innovation is what is the driving incentive behind behind what's being innovated. And to Jesse's point earlier, when we think about, there's a difference about innovating and encouraging innovation on the algorithms, the technology itself, but also innovation built on top of that, right? And again, thinking about drugs, it's not like we're building things on top of other drugs. Yes, sometimes that happens and new drugs evolve and things like that. But in the software space and in the AI space in particular, I think of everything that any business can do with a nice AI tool, and that's going to encourage so much more innovation when it's open, because people can use it and again customize it and tweak it for the follow-on innovations versus and finding the right balance for that with the kind of closed innovation that has to happen to push the models forward, right? And so finding that right balance is something that's going to be, that's what we're here to do.
Anybody else like to speak to that?
I want to just add a little bit and say that I don't think openness per se is the problem. I think it's the risk, uncertainty, and unintended consequences that come with it. And that goes back to the role of policymakers, which is there is a state of the world where careful policy design can really help us get to that sweet spot where we have a good balance between the two. And one of the things that we did in our research is it's interesting that the segment that's hardest to regulate, which we can imagine is highly capable users with very open technology that allow them to tweak a lot of stuff, is the space with the most potential, because that's where really big innovation, huge things can happen. But it's also the hardest to regulate, because you need to think very carefully about how to navigate that policy landscape. And then that goes back to why I think we need to do work early and think through what the role policymakers can play in this market.
Yeah, I think you touched on something really interesting there, and that's the potential harm for having the open model. And one of the harms that people list in at least the mainstream media is the fact that these open AI tools can get in the hands of potential bad actors and do bad things with them. So where do we strike the balance there? Like, how do we ensure that these models remain open, but we ensure that they don't allow for adversarial people to, say, use them to produce a bomb?
Well, I would say, again, it's really important to focus on marginal risk and also look at all the factors that can lead to a capability getting in the hands of a bad actor. And in some ways, the closed AI is a bigger risk simply because of the massive distribution. And so there's a whole range of actors from, the scariest state-sponsored actors who have access to their own capabilities. So like open models don't add anything marginal to that. Then there's the script kiddies who just want the easiest possible thing. And it might be that a closed thing with a nice user interface that's actually cheap is the biggest risk there. Maybe there's something in the middle where, somebody moderately capable can do more stuff with an open model, where there might actually be marginal risk from open. So I think it's important to think really carefully about this. But, this is probably not exciting for anybody who is excited about AI policy, but I actually think the most important thing policymakers can do in policy to prepare for AI, including its benefits and risks, is just like improve governance generally. There was a really great comment in the previous in the previous instance of the series, I think it was by Avi Goldfarb, that a lot of AI policy actually isn't AI policy. If you want a safety net, then you should have a safety net, et cetera, et cetera. And I think dealing with the risks, there's a broad thing called basically societal resilience. Think through, you need to be prepared for pandemics, whether or not they're, engineered. You need to prepare for, the power system needs to be resilient, whether or not it's attacked by AI-assisted cyber attacks. So getting the boring stuff right to create kind of inclusive, good governance, run the trains on time, that is actually across all of society is what's going to produce kind of good outcomes from the broad diffusion of AI capabilities, whether they're open or closed. That's a kind of a very boring and hard message maybe to hear for somebody who really wants to be excited about AI policy, but really get policy right in general, and no matter what direction AI goes in, it'll be good. And I want to emphasize, and it's really in thinking about kind of what, in addition, getting AI policy is difficult, which means even more so it's like important to focus on the basics, and it's difficult because of how fast things are changing. We did a lot of analysis about what makes commercial sense to open or close. Kind of some of the external variables are changing rapidly. I mean, training costs are falling by something like 2 times every year, inferencing costs by something like 10 times, and the opportunity to get value from AI is growing exponentially as businesses are figuring out how to, businesses and other organizations in society are figuring out how to adopt AI in their use cases. So there are all these kind of variables changing that will change, the calculus for whether it makes sense to have something be open or not, as well as kind of the attention to by policymakers. So get the basics right.
That's really helpful, Mike. I think a lot of times I'm guilty of this as well when I look at researching new topics. I'm always interested in doing the new, sexy, attractive thing, but getting basic policy right, I think, is a really important policy message that we just are getting out of this. And Frankie, I think you have something to add.
If I can add to that, I think back to my time in cybersecurity, and in the early days of cybersecurity, it was all about protect the perimeter and keep the bad guys out, right? But eventually, everybody realized, well, the bad guys are going to get in, and sometimes the bad guys are already inside, and so it shifted to much more focus on, assume you're breached and control the inside and segment the inside and do all these things internally. And I think that's kind of similar to what Mike is saying, is that whether it's open or closed, we need guardrails and we need policy and we need things that will address all the use cases, right? And so I think that's a piece of that. And again, putting my cybersecurity hat on, thinking about many of the closed rails, that often the discussion is about, with closed we can have guardrails built into the system, but if it's open, people can take the guardrails off and there's no guardrails. But many research researchers have shown that we can get around the guardrails for the closed systems quite easily, right? So if, whatever closed system is not supposed to do what, let you build a bomb or do whatever, you can find a way around that, right? And so I think that, the risks that we see for both open and closed, many of them are overlapping. And I think many more are overlapping than what people generally think about.
That's great. Would anybody else like to speak to that comment, or shall we move on?
I would just underline really quickly, cyber is a great example of like getting the basics right. So we need to make our systems more secure, broadly pushing the kind of secure by design kind of principles. And that will be tremendously beneficial whether the adversary is AI assisted or not.
Great. Yeah.
I would add, like, historically, like, we can look at Linux server versus Windows server, right? I mean, in the end, Linux server with a lot of community contribution is very secure, right? Contrary to the common belief. Yeah.
Thanks, Carl. Jesse?
I was just going to add to the boring argument of, this is obviously the most powerful technology that came around, but it's not the first time we deal with dual-use technologies, right? Many powerful technologies, nuclear, biotech, has that dual-use characteristic where we are worried about what if it falls in the hand of bad actors. So this is not a brand new challenge for us. So there are many lessons learned from these other technologies that we can take, and specifically also to understanding how bad actors can potentially use them and how to have tailored kind of strategies to prevent them to use these technologies would then be something that we can learn from previously how we engage with powerful technologies.
That's great.
Just to add on to
Please,
that, I fully agree with that, and also take it one step further, because we've also seen openness enter that, and the thing that comes to mind is 3D printed firearms, right? And say whatever, everybody's positions may differ on firearms, but like my niece, who's 7 years old, has a 3D printer, so theoretically she could go on the internet and make herself a gun, right? But and that's been around for a decade at this point, probably. And I think we did some things right in terms of policy around that, and some things took us a little while to learn, but that's the type of thing we can learn from, right? The dual-use technologies, especially in the context where openness came later, right? Like or was there from the beginning. Either way, we can learn a lot from those kind of corollaries and parallels.
Yeah, I think something else we can learn a lot from history, which sort of builds on the next question that we have, is that the people that are innovating these new technologies, a handful of them come from large tech companies, and some of them come from small startups out of nowhere. If we think about that now in the lens of AI and policy, we know that most of the very powerful tools of AI are being developed by relatively large tech firms, but can open source to some extent sort of rebalance the playing field. Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. So if you look at, the common belief, like Sam Altman always say, don't worry about don't think, if you're a small startup, don't think about doing anything with the model, right? I mean, DeepSeek proved he is wrong. So I think this is just an example. I think the most interesting thing right now in the Valley, there's a theory of single-person unicorn. I think that's a lot of the movement where the AI-first companies are the ones who can take, whether open or closed source, and make it really useful to their business. So I think that's a very intriguing aspect. And Jesse and I were talking about, so that there's a little bit counterintuitive, because open source is hard to use by the non-technical startups. But I think the history of Linux and with companies like Red Hat, right? All these distribution companies help, less technical savvy, small, medium business customers to adopt the technology. I think that's really the sort of the new phenomena.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I'll pick up on that too. I think one important thing to keep in mind, and this goes back to the earlier discussion on innovation and use cases, some of the work that myself and my team have done on open source across the globe has shown that it's not only about the companies themselves, but it's also about the country level investments in infrastructure, education, technical skills, and things like that. And so with open source in general, we find that startups that are in countries that are less well endowed with investments in those types of complementary goods actually get much less out of using and contributing to open source. And so I think there's it's not only a story about open source, it's a story about the ecosystems in which the AI exists, and whether, in some instances, closed and user friendly, and I can just type in whatever I want and I get back useful information. That may be the most useful thing for small businesses. But in other contexts where there's more investment in infrastructure, we can think about open being even more valuable and enabling those startups to go even further. And this is, I will say that, when we think about the negatives, we tend to think about the kind of catastrophic types of things, but conversations I've had with kind of NGOs and in the developing economic context, one of the worries is that AI in general is going to lead to an even bigger inequality between the haves and the have-nots at the global scale. And personally, I think open can help with that, because it gives people the ability to tinker and learn and experiment and customize in ways that closed doesn't. But at the same time, again, if you don't have that existing kind of investments in education and in tech and all these types of things, then it may be impossible, or at least very difficult for those folks to take advantage of that.
Great. Let's move on now to global policy. I think something that everybody is interested in the audience here. And we know if we just take a step back, we could see that both the United States, China, and Europe all seem to be taking different approaches to AI openness. And given these different approaches that are being taken across the globe, what risks do those differences pose to global cooperation? Like to go, Jesse?
Sure. So one of the things that we think a lot about in our work is the market segmentation, right? Which is how AI technology can be used in different ways, and how the policy environment would affect how users engage with these technologies. So driving them from, like, say, if you have a country that's very strict with not allowing open source to be in place, then it will change kind of what model is available on the market. The same way, the other way around. What it means for different countries to have different approaches is that you can be hit by a surprise, right? This is a global community. You can regulate your own market, but when someone else outside of the country releases something, chances are you won't be as effective. And I think it creates a danger of a model being released into a market that you don't necessarily already have the guidelines to ensure that it's safe, ensure it's safe use in a sense. So I think this is where coordinated, to some degree, kind of guidelines and regulations is really helpful in the global community. Because again, the use of these technologies are global. Then there's something to be said about having regulations and approaches to these things that are at least somewhat coordinated across different countries as well.
Yeah, I would really emphasize that open source is a global community, and the AI development community is also global in a sense, including, even though there are very, different policy regimes across China, the US, and Europe, you actually see, some innovative open models being released from companies in like all three of those areas. And I think that has benefits, including kind of for security reasons. We want to minimize the chance of technological surprise, and also keep the kind of research communication going in all directions. So I actually think a big risk is actually kind of limiting that global collaboration that actually brings more risks than benefits. And I forgot the rest of my thought.
Well, it's a complex thought, let's be honest about it. And there's a lot of factors pulling and pushing these discussions globally. And there's a lot of intergovernmental organizations that are trying to bring these people together and consider them. So
Yeah. Oh, the rest of my thought was, I think the difference, a lot of differences actually come at deployments. And I think in my first comment, I talked about how policy can be overly focused on models when, you know, that's just a component of an application that's delivered to an end user or deployed on a server. And of course, even an open model that's made available via a server to users in China or the US or Europe is going to comply with, the service provider is going to comply with local laws, so the experience may be quite different.
thanks, Mike.
I'll extend some of that thinking about the policies that have been discussed and bandied about here already. And I think certainly there was some questions about should we outlaw open source AI in the US, right? Because it's going to open up, you know, it's going to allow our competitors to leapfrog and move faster. And I think, you know, frankly, the cat's already out of the bag. It's too late, right? And I think then, therefore, the real question is, you know, do we want to be at the cutting edge or do we not want to be at the cutting edge? And I think again, you know, historically, open source was often a fast follower and it would, you know, you mentioned Linux and with Windows and the battle in the early days of open source. I think often, you know, the cutting edge happened in proprietary land, and then open source would kind of be a fast follower and an innovator as well. But today, in AI, data analytics, all these types of things, open source is the leading edge, right? And has been from, you know, for a decade. And I think that therefore, you know, outlawing open source AI in the US would be a massive competitive disadvantage, and would give, you know, our competitors and our allies, you know, a big step up in kind of the race to you know, be at that cutting edge. And so, and the other, I'll also point out, you know, I think to Jesse's point, one of the recent things in the one big beautiful bill that was, you know, some people didn't realize was in there, but was a push to prevent the U.S. states from having their own AI regulations. And I'll admit, I actually had some mixed feelings on that because, again, coming from a cybersecurity background, a very tough thing for companies was that every single state had its own cybersecurity regulation. So when a breach happened, you had no idea which laws you were supposed to follow, and it was actually quite complicated. And so, you know, as much as I think often the states regulate and push the envelope for tech regulation faster than the federal government, it can make things harder for businesses when there's 50 different regulations to follow. And to Jesse's point and Mike's point, AI and certainly open source AI are international, you know, by design. And so having a hodgepodge of international regulations is certainly going to make things more complicated for anybody who's operating beyond one jurisdiction.
That's great. And I think as we look forward to the future, we see that innovation is happening quickly. We see that different companies are choosing different models for their own AI development. But what we know is that the performance effects and the predictability of these models are going to get better over time. And we know that because they're achieving greater efficiency, both in terms of their use of compute, their coding, and their ability to gather better data sets for these models. So if we're thinking about AI into the future, what's one value or principle that should guide future AI, irregardless of whether it's open or closed? I'm glad I'm asking the questions and not answering them.
Well, I can start. The word that comes to mind for me is balanced. I talk, and I think that's true for any type of policy. There are trade-offs, and there are hard trade-offs when it comes to AI. And I think finding that balance is so key, and it's not just, you know, when it comes to open and close, it also comes to Frank's point about, you know, who's going to benefit from AI and who's going to suffer the unintended negative consequences, social impact of AI. Long-term versus short-term implications, right? I think so there's a lot of trade-offs here that I think a really important thing for us to think through is not to slow things down, but not to drive things faster, but how to find that balance where we give ourselves enough time to do things right, but also not to intentionally slow down the progress that we know that is going to be good overall. So I think the balance here is really what comes to mind for me.
Okay, so Jesse says balance. Mike, do you have any thoughts?
Well, can I boil it down to one word? I'll say basics to reiterate my prior non-AI comment is probably the most important thing for AI. But I would also second basic. basics. I think that, a basic test as you're thinking about AI policy is how is this going to work for an open weights model? Is the policy you're thinking about, achievable for a developer releasing an open weights model? And if it's not, I'm happy to discuss that with you. But if it's not, it's probably a sign that the model developer is the wrong target. You should instead be thinking about systems, applications, deployment. So that's, I think, a kind of principle to think about.
Yeah, I'll maybe spin off Jesse's comment and say trade-offs, right? And because I think again, I'll go back to this, who do we want to encourage and incentivize to innovate, and where are we going to get a bigger positive while reducing, potential negatives, right? And I think that to me is the tension is, do we need 20-year patents around closed AI systems so that to incentivize the AI folks to innovate, or do we need more openness? Mike's laughing. My answer would probably be certainly not 20 years. But or do we need more openness to allow all the other businesses that are not the ones building AI to use the AI in a more effective manner and to build on top of it, right? And I certainly see, AI, I don't think the phrase general purpose technology has come up yet today, but it's something that enables everything else, right? And so given that it's that type of technology, then the broader societal impact that it will have will be in the things that build on top of it, not just, the technology itself.
How about you, Carl?
Okay, so since I'm coming from sort of joining the AI world from the robotics context, I would like to answer this in the robotics context. I believe from a sort of a basic rule perspective, the Asimov's 3 laws of robotics tend to be the guideline, right? So how we implement it is a different thing. I mean, in a lot of ways today is all sorts of robots, right? And Jensen Huang said all the digital side is informational robots, and eventually we'll have embodied AI will be physical robots. So the 3 laws will be a robot may not injure a human being, or through inaction allow human being to come to harm. So that's law number 1. Law number 2 is a robot must obey orders given by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with law number 1. Number 3 is a robot must protect his own existence as long as such protection doesn't conflict with either law number 1 or law number 2. So I believe that's still a guiding principle. It's just how we implement it.
Thank you very much. So now we're going to move on to the final part of the moderated panel discussion, and that is we will open it up to the audience. So if you have questions, raise your hands. Unfortunately, we don't have mics today, but we'll need you to speak relatively loudly, but we'd love to hear from you. So please raise your hand. Go back, please, with the tie.
Yeah, hi. So thank you all so much for a fantastic panel so far. So I was really interested in DeepSeek's recent choice to make open source elements of its inference engine, and then to fork that back into VLLM on GitHub. And I was really interested, the coda to that was a vision of open source technology, right? So a AI stack that is completely agnostic to any tech stack. So that sounds to me like outside the US, NVIDIA tech stack. What does it look like if there's no capture for the technology, right? So what if AI is now unbundled from tech stacks and is agnostic? What does that mean for us?
Unbundled from what? From the infer, or from what? What do you mean?
So I think in this case from CUDA and NVIDIA chips, and the wording was tech agnostic hardware.
Okay. Yeah, so again, there's different layers of all these, right? So I think from an algorithm risk innovation point of view, I think the underlying sort of GPU or TPU or NPU architecture matters, but to a large degree. I think especially with a very narrow focus sort of applications such as RRM or GPT, the importance of CUDA is there, but it's not as general purpose AI applications. So people can find optimization techniques from just, using TPU or NPU as well. So that's known.
Do we have another question? Yes, please.
I want to ask about open versus closed AI and antitrust. I'm an IO economist, so that's what I was thinking about. So, like, the folk intuition is like close off any software ecosystem that's going to help companies build moats and do that for concentration, the exercise of market power, and so on. But I don't actually know if that's true. That's just like an intuition people have. I haven't written the model down. I was wondering if anyone had any thoughts about whether open AI is democratizing from a market power perspective.
IO economist, do you want to start?
Yeah, so one of the things that we looked into was exactly kind of thinking about what it means. We actually started from that hypothesis, right? Like when it comes to market power concentration. And then as we start thinking about what openness and closeness means, we realized it's a spectrum, as in there would be infinite many markets, especially as this technology matures. The type of interactions users have with the technology will be differentiated in a very specific way. And then we start to think, well, then what it naturally means is there's no winner-take-all situation anyways. So it almost is like, it's not, I don't think it takes a open source model or a completely open model to democratize that in terms of antitrust perspective. I think even if there is no completely open model, as we go, there's going to be more different type of models. One of the things is along the dimension of the degree of openness that will allow the market to become more sophisticated, to become more diverse. And if you think about recently how small tech is becoming, more pronounced in Washington, and I think that's a demonstration of that, which is as technology matures, as these developers realize there's like market gaps in how people want to use the technology, but it's not being provided by open big tech company, it will just naturally follow that way. So I think we are kind of past the point, like what Frank said, right? The cat is already outside the box. We already have a different spectrum of openness when it comes to the model that's already present. It's just going to get more sophisticated in terms of the type of model that enters the market. So I do think that eventually we are moving to that in that direction, regardless of what is the most open model on the market.
And I'll add on to that and actually go back to Mike's very first comments. When we think about Gen AI and the AI that we're all focused on at the moment, there's compute, there's the training data, and then there's the models themselves, and those and then there's the weights, right, that come out of the training. And I think that and this sort of goes to the prior question about the NVIDIA stack and the tech stack. The question is, I mean, presumably, if we're thinking about our antitrust hats on, we want to avoid monopolization in all of those buckets, right? And so the question to me is, what we've seen is that the most openness is happening at the model space, and then the weights, and then maybe the data, and then not really the infrastructure, right? And so I think that's, when we think about where openness will lead to more or less likelihood of antitrust, I think it may, if the models themselves continue to become more and more open, we may see antitrust concerns move to other pieces in that kind of ecosystem, right? And then I think too that it just sort of, if everything was open completely, okay, then we don't have competition, and we also don't have antitrust concerns. But obviously that's not the way it's going to be. There's a spectrum of openness, and so the question is just again, even if we say all models are open, for example, right, then there may be a chance of antitrust concerns at somewhere higher up in the stack, right, and things that are built on top of the models. And so I think it's just a matter of understanding the full ecosystem and knowing that there can be possibilities for concentration, market power concentration in any of these pieces.
I just have to put the human in the loop, so to speak, in a different way. I mean, Frank's totally right that you've got compute data, that electricity are also kind of inputs to the model, but also humans are really important inputs. It takes tremendously skilled engineers to develop these models and then to deploy them in applications throughout society. So I think that kind of access to talent is a really critical to keep in mind what they were thinking about from national competitiveness or from kind of inter-company competitiveness.
Agree.
Great, thank you. Carl, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm a true believer that the open source would definitely help to democratize the Gen AI. It's just because right now we're kind of using a internet and mobile internet sort of paradigm to look at the Gen AI, right? And then you need big capital, you need lots of compute, and you have control. That's what the closed system used to be. But I think Bill Gates said this, right? In the AI era, the AI first company won't be this, like the guys that used to be big in the mobile computing or cloud era. I mean, think about it doesn't matter the size. NVIDIA is a nobody in those eras. They merely have a small niche in the PC. They don't have anything in mobile compute. Now they are, I think, on the infrastructure level, they're an AI first company. Then on the software side, there's yet many smaller players will emerge as AI first companies, and they can take advantage of the open source.
Great. I think we have lots of questions now. In the very back, please.
Yeah. Thanks, Tim. Great panel. I want to go to the idea of a CERN for AI. And really here we're trying to help Africa. It's pretty far out of the loop. And I think Frank alluded to the fact, if you don't have the ecosystem, it's going to be hard to do open AI, but can't a lot of those global South countries come together and try to do something collectively? And should that be an initiative everyone backs, and should it be open source?
Yeah, so great question. I think I'm going to probably pronounce it wrong or get it wrong, but the Wadhwani group has been working on something along those lines and investing basically in AI for developing countries and and I don't actually know how heavily invested they are in open source versus closed or exactly where they are on that dimension, but certainly I think there's a lot of good that AI in general and open source AI in particular can do for the global south, but the question as to whether that it should be centered in like a CERN type of organization is a very good one. I mean, again, that would presumably help you build some of the infrastructure and the education and the tech training and everything like that. The question then is does it leave Switzerland in the case of CERN, or does it stay kind of very local, right? And I think that's one of the kind of questions again, is that you need this to be able to take advantage of these types of technologies. You need the people using them to have the ability to actually take advantage of them. And I think that's there's again it comes down to when we're talking about a general purpose technology, building the technology versus using the technology are actually two different things, and both are important and beneficial, but require different kind of policy levers for that.
One more question. Let's go in the front here.
Oh,
thank you.
Thank you, by the way. This is a great panel. I really learned a lot in listening to you. Sort of going back to this notion of the AI stack in general, having to do with compute data and then the model. I have a question about the data. Now, I know the technology in AI and the algorithms is moving in directions that are more efficient in the use of data. So the reliance on proprietary data may or may not be as important in the future as it has been in the applications that we now see used in production processes in companies. But I think there's a real policy issue here, and this is the question, is that one of the ways this technology could spread across non-tech businesses is if the data that's important for training models that affect the production processes, services or manufacturing, could be made more open. And industries sometimes figure this out themselves. There's, a move towards open banking, anyway, in insurance markets, et cetera. But I was just wondering what your thoughts on that. I mean, how the technology and the openness of models might affect the data policy at the industry level.
Yeah, I'll take a first shot. I think it's a great question. I think the data is something that's often forgotten about when people are talking about having these discussions. I'll slightly tweak one of your statements. I think that there's a data set called Common Crawl that that scanned the internet and open sourced all the data that it found, right, in a kind of machine readable, reasonably well formatted manner. And most of the models that we know and think of today, that is a large chunk of the training set that training data that they use, right? And so I know OpenAI uses it. I assume DeepSeek uses it. I know Llama uses it. Like everybody uses that as at least a very large chunk of, because then you don't have to go scan the entire world's internet by yourself, right? Because somebody's already done that. Now, so then the question becomes, what else is in that mix, right? Like what else is being added to that?
It's gotta be operating data for companies.
And so certainly when we think about the training, the base models, right, like there's one question there, but then there's the inference layer, the training for customizing for your company that happens later, right? And so I think that, already there's a common open data set that lots of these models use. The question is how far does that get us, right? And what do we, and how does that impact antitrust and a lot of the things that we care about from a policy perspective? And so the answer is we're working on it. So myself and others are looking at kind of the value of data for training AI, right? And there's been a few papers coming out about that recently. Sure.
Okay. Yeah. So I think just if you look at the model, typically you have a layered architecture, right, or structure. So generally, the foundation models are typically referred to L0 models, where they use common cross, mostly public available data. And when it comes to industry specific, then that's the layer 1, for example, anything healthcare related. Some are public, some are not. So typically, whenever you use proprietary data, then if you open source that, the weight, then there's clear potential violation of NDA, right? So all of the sign. So I think that, yes. Yeah. Then that's layer 1. And layer 2 is really company specific data, and that's clearly shouldn't be open. The weight shouldn't be open because in a way those are proprietary information. So when you look at open source, typically people assume the models, we're talking about foundational models, whether you open source that versus all the layer 1, layer 2. So,
yeah. I get that. I was just wondering about the policy towards industry sharing of data.
So,
yeah, I have thoughts too, but go ahead.
So just, policy-wise, I'll let these guys know, but I think just the industrial practice side, I think there's another trend right now is that we're trying to generate more synthetic data that kind of sort of hide away all the specific nuances of particular, company. Yeah. And if you, that's a good approach for advancing at least at the layer 1 level.
And I think you mentioned open banking, right? So for those of you who don't know, the UK implemented some regulations a few years ago, right? And forcing the largest 7 banks, I think it was, to open their data to smaller banks, right? I don't think it had to be fully public, but other banking institution.
No, other
Was it?
banking institutions.
Other banking institutions, yeah, exactly. So I think this goes back to kind of the open versus closed antitrust types of questions. Is that, are the large banks getting some, we'll say unfair benefit just based on their size because they have better data and they can train better models? Well, the UK has tried something with that. I haven't actually seen much research on it. It's been on my radar for years, but I've been always curious as to whether that would increase competition and allow for smaller banks to either grow or to at least function more efficiently as a result of
I
that.
know of one paper we can.
We'll talk after
I
this.
mean, I'm really glad actually you brought up this question. I'm also cognizant of everybody's time. We're getting towards the end of this event, but I'd just like to tell you, like we said, this is the second in a multi-part series. The next event we're actually planning is on AI and data. So we'll be focusing specifically on these questions, Carol, that you raised, and we'll delve deeper into the questions around the empirical questions, the performance questions, but also the policy questions that face these companies. So I would just like to take the time to thank our panelists today for really engaging these questions, and the conversation has been great and fruitful. I'd also like to thank the audience for your amazing questions and for coming and being patient while we set everything up. And finally, I'd like to thank my colleagues at the Georgetown Center of Business and Public Policy who were actually caught in a traffic jam. And normally they have 45 minutes to set everything up, and today they did it in 5. And I really want to thank them for their hard work, and I want to thank you for your patience. And we hope to see you in the fall. Thank you.
No, I didn't call, but I had signed up for it. I just found out.
Tim, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm Jeff.
Oh, hi. Yes, yeah. Oh, sure. By the way, you should meet Frank really quick, who's you.
I've read
Sorry.
here at work.
Um,